The wind came off the Pacific in cold, sharp bursts. It carried salt and the smell of kelp rotting on rocks below the training compound. The metal catwalks of Trident Complex groaned under the pressure steel flexing against steel bolts that had held for 30 years now, singing a low, tired note that only men who'd spent decades near the ocean could recognize. The sound was distant now, muted beneath something heavier. Tension. It hung in the air like smoke from a flare that wouldn't die. Thick, visible if you knew what to look for, and every man standing in that arena knew exactly what to look for. They were already gathered. 301 Navy SEALs lined in tight, orderly rows around the perimeter of the outdoor training enclosure. Some leaned against the chain-link fence with arms crossed over plate carriers still warm from the morning's exercises. Others crouched low, knees bent, weight distributed like they were waiting for contact. A few sat on the bleachers with rifles propped between their boots, hands resting on barrels worn smooth by salt water and sand. Every one of them had been pulled from rotation, yanked out of deployment prep, post-mission decompression, or the precious 48 hours of sleep that SEALs hoarded like ammunition. They'd been told to report to Trident at 600 for a mandatory demonstration. No explanation, no context, just an order stamped with a classification level that meant you didn't ask questions. This wasn't a show. This was something else. At the center of the enclosure stood a woman, alone, still. Her boots planted shoulder-width apart on the blue vinyl mat that covered the concrete floor. She wore standard Navy fatigues, the kind that didn't draw attention. Dark green, tight black braid tucked under her cover, utility belt worn clean, no patches, no unit insignia, no rank displayed on her outerwear. Just one faded tag on the inside of her gear bag, barely visible when she'd set it down near the edge of the mat. Thorn E Med Response, Marsoc Diver 2, Captain Elena Thorn, 31 years old. 5'5", maybe 145 pounds soaking wet, former Marine Force reconnaissance medic with a specialty classification most SEALs had only seen referenced in classified after-action reports. She adjusted her gloves in silence, fingers flexing once, twice, then going still. Her back was straight, her chin level, not proud, not hesitant, just steady. Most of the SEALs didn't know what to make of her. A few exchanged glances. Low murmurs rippled through the ranks like wind through tall grass. Some tilted their heads as if waiting for someone more impressive to step into the ring. Someone bigger. Someone with a chest full of medals and a reputation that preceded them like artillery fire. They hadn't read the report. The one buried 3 layers deep in the classified archive system. The one that detailed how Captain Elena Thorn had stabilized a critically injured diver at 380 feet below the surface of the Philippine Sea. How she'd performed a needle decompression on a collapsed lung using only a dive knife and a CO2 cartridge, while water rose against her mask and the hull of the USS Connecticut groaned like a dying animal around her. How she'd dislocated her own shoulder to fit through a 14-inch gap in a collapsed bulkhead, then relocated the joint herself once she was clear, all while calculating decompression schedules in her head and dragging 2 unconscious men toward the surface. The transmission had been recorded, archived, studied. Med 1 to control 2 divers stable, I'm bringing them up. Shoulders displaced but functional. Decompression schedule Alpha 3. Her voice hadn't shaken, not once. To the men standing in the Trident arena, she was just another instructor. Another checkbox on the Navy's diversity compliance list. Another woman flown in to demonstrate some sanitized version of combat medicine that would look good in a briefing, but fall apart under real pressure. To her, this was another drill. One more chance to teach survival in a scenario nobody rehearses until it's too late. Commander Daniel Garrett stepped onto the steel observation riser that overlooked the mat. He was 71 years old, silver-haired, with shoulders that hadn't softened, despite the years, and a face carved from decades of salt wind and hard decisions. He wore his service ribbons across his chest like a roadmap of conflicts most of the younger SEALs had only read about in history books. Grenada, Panama, the First Gulf War, operations that didn't have names, only numbers and dates burned into classified logs. He'd been 29 years old when a training platform collapsed off Coronado in 1982, trapping him and 3 other SEALs under 2 tons of steel and rising water. He'd been drowning, they all had, And then a 21-year-old combat medic trainee named Sarah Brennan had broken his collarbone with her bare hands to pull him through a gap he shouldn't have fit through. He'd screamed into his regulator, thought she was killing him. She'd saved his life. Now, 42 years later, Daniel Garrett stood above another mat, watching another woman prepare to teach another lesson that men twice her size wouldn't believe until their bones told them otherwise. "Attention," he called, his voice cut through the murmurs like a blade through silk. 301 SEALs snapped into silence. "This afternoon's demonstration," Garrett continued, his tone flat and factual, "will cover close quarters reversal under simulated subsurface entanglement conditions. Your instructor, Captain Elena Thorne, has been authorized to perform live demonstrations of release and neutralization techniques applicable to medics or divers trapped under hostile pressure." He paused, let the words settle. "Each maneuver is approved. All force will be controlled. The purpose of this session is to observe efficiency, not brute execution." A few SEALs nodded. Most remained still, eyes fixed forward, waiting. Garrett's gaze swept across the ranks, then stopped. Held. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "Captain Thorne is also the only reason 2 men are breathing today after a pressure hull failure off Luzon in 2019. So if you're expecting a promotional video, you're in the wrong place." Elena didn't react. She didn't need Commander Garrett to speak for her. Her work had never required an introduction. It spoke in the language of saved lives and techniques so precise they bordered on surgical. But she understood the game. Understood that in a room full of men who'd built their identities on physical dominance, credibility had to be established before competence could be demonstrated. Behind the ring of quiet, the murmurs started again. Subtle, confident, carried on exhales and dismissive shrugs. Not everyone was ready to learn from someone who didn't look like them. Not yet. Near the front of the formation, 2 men shifted their weight like predators watching prey enter their territory. Petty Officer First Class Dalton Briggs stood with his arms crossed high, just under his jaw, the way men do when they want their size to fill the space before their words do. 6'3", 240 pounds. Barrel-chested, thick-necked, shoulders wide as a riot shield. His forearms were corded with muscle that looked like it had been carved from oak and left to harden in seawater. He'd been a college wrestler before the Navy, the kind who pinned opponents so hard the ref had to check for injuries before calling the match. Beside him stood Petty Officer Second Class Cade Kessler. Leaner, narrower build, sinewy muscle coiled tight like braided steel cable. He was a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt, a competitive grappler who'd spent the last 8 years learning how to fold human joints in directions they weren't designed to go. His expression rarely changed, but when it did, it smirked. A cold, quiet kind of arrogance that didn't need volume to make itself known. Both men were from Poseidon Team, a unit known for brutal waterborne breach training and an ego that matched the depth of the ocean they operated in. Both men had reputations, not just for finishing top of their hand-to-hand rotations, but for making sure everyone knew it. As Elena knelt beside her gear bag and began laying out a compressed training harness in a simulated tangle net, Kessler leaned slightly toward Briggs. His voice was low but loud enough for the 10 men nearest to hear. "What's she gonna teach us? How to duck?" Briggs let out a grunt, something between a scoff and a growl deep in his chest like an engine idling too low. "I've carried men twice her size out of hull breaches with a cracked spine, and they're calling this an instructor." The jab landed. A few of the younger SEALs within earshot cracked faint smiles. Uncertain ones. The kind that appear when you're not sure if you're allowed to laugh, but the guy next to you just did. Most of the ring stayed silent, stone-faced, watching. Elena didn't look their way, but she felt it. You don't need eyes to detect arrogance. You only need tension. It moves through the air like a shift in current underwater. Subtle, undeniable. She continued laying out the drill apparatus with the kind of focus that didn't ask for respect. It demanded it, not with bravado, not with posturing, with silence. Precision. Confidence earned in places the men around her wouldn't talk about out loud. But Briggs and Kessler didn't pick up on that. They only saw someone smaller, someone non-operational, someone who didn't belong in the pit with men who broke doors and cleared rooms and dragged bleeding teammates out of firefights. When Commander Garrett stepped forward again and addressed the ring, his tone sharpened. This drill simulates partial entanglement under a double constraint scenario. The instructor will begin in a prone back-down posture with both upper and lower limb restriction applied by volunteers. He scanned the crowd. Volunteers. Before he'd even finished the word, Briggs stepped forward. One boot, then another. Deliberate, confident. His movement was a statement before he had said a word. Kessler followed without a sound, no hesitation, just a quiet shift in weight that carried him from the formation into the open space near the mat. There was no protocol check, no clarifying question, no nod of understanding. They had already made up their minds. This wasn't going to be a demonstration. It was going to be a message. Briggs turned toward the other SEALs with a theatrical shrug, arms spreading wide, like he was inviting them into a joke. Let's see if she can break 2 real pins. Kessler just smiled, calm, quiet, dismissive. Commander Garrett's eyes narrowed. His jaw tightened just barely, the kind of micro-expression that only men who'd served under him for years would recognize as a warning. You understand this is a controlled speed demonstration only, Garrett said. His voice was level, but the edge was there, sharp enough to cut if you weren't listening carefully. No competitive force, no impact trauma, no escalated pin pressure. Briggs nodded. His face was neutral, respectful even. Of course, sir. Kessler added, standard speed, we'll follow her lead. Lies. Their bodies told the truth, shoulders already tightening, weight shifting forward onto the balls of their feet, hands flexing, fingers curling and uncurling in anticipation. They were already calculating control points, already preparing to turn this into a low-grade takedown disguised as miscommunication. Elena simply nodded once. She didn't look at Briggs, didn't look at Kessler. Her gaze was fixed somewhere past them, focused on nothing and everything at once. The kind of 1,000-yard stare that comes from environments where hesitation equals death. I'll demonstrate the standard release and counterpin, she said. Her voice was even, clear, loud enough to carry across the mat without rising in pitch or volume. If the attackers escalate, the technique escalates. The tone didn't waver, didn't shake, but it sliced clean through the ring of 301 men like a blade through still water. Because whether they realized it yet or not, those two had just signed up for something they couldn't unvolunteer from. The mat was warm from sun and boots. Elena stepped to the center, unfazed by the low thud of combat shoes circling behind her. She rolled her shoulders once, quietly, loosening tension the way she had before every underwater simulation, before every collapsed compartment extraction, before every moment where her body would have to respond faster than thought, breathing in through her nose, out through her teeth, calibrated, calm. Briggs and Kessler moved to flank her. Not like professionals setting up a training scenario, like predators closing in on prey they didn't respect. She dropped to her back, slowly, deliberately, letting both arms relax by her sides, legs aligned with the marking tape on the mat. Standard prone restraint for a subsurface dual body pin simulation. The kind of entrapment scenario that happens inside a flooded cabin or a collapsed tank compartment. Tight quarters, no leverage. Just pain and control. She looked up once toward Commander Garrett at the edge of the riser. Ready? He didn't speak, only gave a single nod of confirmation. Briggs stepped around to her upper left, looming like a wall, hands flexing, knuckles cracking. Kessler crouched by her feet, the grin now gone, replaced by something colder, something focused, determined. I'll take shoulders, Briggs muttered. Legs are mine, Kessler replied. The exchange wasn't for her benefit, it was for the crowd. Still posturing, still pretending this was about proving a point. Elena closed her eyes for one breath, then opened them again, locking every nerve into micro-position awareness. Hips aligned, shoulders anchored, chin slightly tucked. Briggs lowered over her, one knee planting outside her left shoulder, the other bracing against her sternum. Not gently. She'll never break both of us, he muttered loud enough for the front ranks to hear. Kessler chimed in, crouching low, both hands ghosting above her calves. We'll go easy. Don't want her to sprain anything. The laughs didn't come. Not this time. A quiet fell over the watching SEALs. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others went dead still. The ring had gone tight, not just in formation but in the air itself. because everyone felt it now. This wasn't normal banter. This was the pressure you get right before something goes too far. Elena didn't speak. She just adjusted her wrist position on the mat, slightly offsetting her elbows. 1 inch, maybe less, but enough. She didn't breathe faster. She didn't twitch. She just waited. Commander Garrett raised one hand. He paused for a beat longer than normal, as if silently giving the two operators a final off-ramp, a chance to reconsider. Then he spoke. Begin slow phase contact. Neither man obeyed. There was no slow phase. There was no simulation. Briggs came down hard, slamming his full forearm across Elena's collarbone in a crushing V-shaped pin that compressed her neck and shoulders. His elbow pressed dangerously close to her throat. It wasn't instructional pressure. It wasn't even competitive pressure. It was domination. Below, Kessler dropped both knees over her thighs and locked his arms around her boots in a tight combat wrap. A real restraint, not a demonstration grip. The kind of hold you use when you want someone immobilized. Contained, humiliated. The entire ring flinched. You didn't need to be trained to see the difference. This wasn't contact control. This was a statement. Briggs leaned in his face inches from hers, breath hot and sour with morning coffee. Show us something real, Sergeant. Kessler tightened his grip hard enough to whiten his knuckles. Hard enough that the tendons in his forearms stood out like cables under tension. Yeah, break free now. The trap had been set, the fuse lit, and in that exact second, everything changed. Elena's eyes opened fully. Her breathing didn't spike, but something behind her expression vanished. The stillness was gone. What replaced it was colder, cleaner, deadlier. She wasn't simulating anymore. She was surviving. You are no longer inside demonstration protocol. The words came flat, calm, loud enough for every man in the ring to hear. Not a threat, not a promise. A factual acknowledgement that they had crossed the threshold from controlled drill into live response conditions. A few SEALs in the front row sucked in breath. One whispered, "Oh, hell." Commander Garrett froze mid-step. He knew what that sentence meant. Everyone did. It meant she was no longer bound by the restrictions of the demo. It meant her counters would be real. It meant escalation would be proportional to survival, not instruction. It meant these two men had just triggered something they could not reverse. But Briggs didn't hear the warning. Or maybe he heard it and didn't respect it. He pressed harder, grinding his forearm deeper into her collarbone. Not enough to crush bone, but enough to bruise, to choke, to dominate. Quit talking and escape, Sergeant. Kessler grinned again, breath sharp and confident. Yeah, move. Both men had no idea, absolutely no idea, that they were 3 seconds away from learning something they would remember for the rest of their lives. If they ever walked the same way again. Briggs never saw it. Not the shift, not the breath, not the exact micro-adjustment of Elena's hips that came next. All he felt, if he even registered it, was the sudden release of resistance. Her body previously pinned and still gave beneath him. Not from surrender, from precision. A deliberate collapse of muscular tension that baited him forward, lured him deeper into the trap. His arm pressed harder into her collarbone. And that's when it happened. Her left elbow slid upward. It didn't rise with force. It pivoted inward, skimming under his armpit like a knife being unsheathed from a hidden holster. Before Briggs could even process the movement, her fingers had hooked under his elbow, finding the soft, vulnerable pocket just above the joint where nerve clusters run close to bone. Simultaneously, her opposite shoulder shifted back half an inch. Her hips pivoted, her spine torqued, and then crack. The sound echoed across the enclosure like dry wood splintering under weight. Briggs didn't scream at first. His body simply jerked sideways violently, as if yanked by an invisible wire. His elbow bent the wrong way, shoulder twisting out of socket as Elena executed a full spiral lock using his own pressure against him. His mass became his enemy. 240 pounds of muscle and bone turned into leverage she controlled with surgical precision. He hit the mat hard, chest first, face bouncing against the vinyl with a breathless exhale that sounded like a balloon being popped. His legs kicked instinctively, scrambling for purchase, but his upper body was done. Disarmed, disassembled, broken. The ring of SEALs gasped as one, audible, shocked. It hadn't taken 10 seconds. It hadn't taken 5. It had taken 2.3 seconds from pin to collapse. Elena didn't pause. She rolled up from her back in one fluid motion, her boots pivoting beneath her left knee planting lightly into the mat, arms poised, not in aggression, in readiness. Briggs writhed beside her, clutching his elbow with his other hand, mouth open in a silent scream that would find its voice in a few more seconds. The guttural sounds coming from his throat made it clear he wasn't getting up again. Kessler, still clamped around her ankles, blinked in disbelief. What the hell? But Elena had already shifted her weight. Her breathing was calm, measured. Her hands didn't shake. She didn't even glance at Briggs. Her full attention was now locked on Kessler. The crowd wasn't moving. Commander Garrett hadn't spoken. Every man in that ring was frozen, mouths open, eyes wide. They had just witnessed a man known for overpowering training partners crumple in under 3 seconds without a single shout, without theatrics, without warning. And the woman who'd done it was already shifting her heel for the next fold. Kessler's hands twitched. His brain told him to hold on tighter. Lock the grip, brace the legs, pull her back down before she regained full posture. But his body hesitated. Because what he'd just seen, what he'd just felt wasn't training. It was extraction. The kind of movement you don't fake. The kind of reaction born from underwater blackout drills and breach scenarios where hesitation equals death. Still instinct won out. No way she folds me too, he hissed. He yanked hard on her ankles, trying to twist her into a compromised rollover, his knee coming up fast to clamp across her shin. But he didn't account for her hips. Didn't notice the shift in her heel angle. Didn't realize that Elena Thorne had rotated her pelvis off-axis, deliberately misaligning her spine. Not to resist his pull, to redirect it. His own momentum was his mistake. Elena's left leg slid behind his wrist with perfect timing. She didn't fight his drag, she used it. The second he pulled, she dropped her full body weight downward, spinning with the motion, her heel catching the inside of his forearm, just above the ulna, between muscle and joint. Then she twisted inward and drove her foot down. Snap. This time the sound wasn't dry like Briggs's spiral fracture. It was wet, thicker, like a branch torn through instead of snapped across. Kessler's body jolted backward. His hands flew off her legs. His face twisted into something primal. Confused, panicked, shocked by the betrayal of his own arm. He staggered back 2 steps, cradling his forearm against his chest, elbow bent at a sickening angle. My arm, my fucking arm. The words came late. His pain came faster. Elena rose slowly, boots steady, back straight. She didn't step toward him. She didn't lunge. She simply pivoted with surgical control, rotating on her rear foot, reestablishing her stance like she'd never been pinned at all. Kessler's breathing turned shallow. His mouth opened, closed again. He half-stepped forward, like maybe he could still bluff control. She answered without violence. She stepped forward, once fluidly, lowered herself beside him, and placed one palm on the back of his neck. The other braced his elbow. Not with aggression, to stabilize. Her voice was neutral, clear. Stop resisting. Your arm is no longer stable. Kessler froze. Not from fear, from recognition. She wasn't retaliating. She was containing him, protecting him from further injury. She had stopped the break at the joint, hadn't driven it through the shoulder, hadn't fractured the clavicle, hadn't disabled the wrist. She had held back. The crowd saw it. So did he. For the first time since stepping into the ring, Kessler wasn't smirking. He was silent. And in that silence came understanding. This hadn't been luck. This had been control, measured, clinical, dangerous only because it could have gone further, and didn't. No one moved. Not a twitch, not a whisper. 301 Navy SEALs frozen in place, boots pressed into mat and concrete jaws, slack eyes wide. It was like time itself had been ruptured, split clean down the middle by 2 impossible sounds. Crack, then snap. 2 bodies down. Both men incapacitated in a combined 4.1 seconds. And the woman standing in the center didn't flinch, didn't shout, didn't so much as breathe harder. Elena Thorne rose from her crouch beside Kessler like a surgeon stepping away from the operating table. Measured, spine aligned, face composed. She brushed her glove once across her belt line and turned slightly toward Commander Garrett at the edge of the observation riser. Medical response required for both. That was all she said. Her tone didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake. Her stance didn't scream vengeance or vindication. It was all procedure. Around her, the mat was littered with the wreckage of ego. Briggs crumpled on his side, moaning incoherently, one arm limp and twisted at an angle that made several of the watching SEALs look away. Kessler still on his knees, holding his forearm like it might fall off if he let go, lips parted, but mute. No one cheered. No one needed to. Because what they had just seen wasn't entertainment. It wasn't a spectacle. It was anatomy. A demonstration not of strength, but of control. 3 SEALs in the front row exchanged a look, each of them veterans with more deployments than birthdays celebrated in uniform. One of them, a silver-haired operator from Delta Rotation, murmured, just loud enough for the silence to hear. That wasn't power, that was surgical. A medic from the on-site trauma unit was already sprinting in from the edge of the arena, kit in hand, another following 10 feet behind him. Still no one else moved. Commander Garrett stood paralyzed. His clipboard hung limp in his hand like even paper didn't know what to do anymore. And Elena, she didn't bask in it. She didn't look around for approval. She simply stepped back from Kessler 3 paces and stood at parade rest. Boots aligned, breathing steady, gloves now lightly dusted from the mat but otherwise untouched. It was as if the entire exchange had been a rehearsal, a routine she'd done 100 times underwater, under pressure, under blackout conditions, where the margin between life and death was measured in fractions of seconds and millimeters of joint angle. And for the first time since the ring formed that morning, not one man watching her saw a female instructor. They saw something else. They saw the last person they'd ever want to underestimate. The medics dropped to their knees beside Briggs and Kessler. One began checking vitals, fingers on carotid eyes on watch. The other was already bracing joints, hands moving with the practiced efficiency of men who'd seen combat injuries in a dozen countries and knew the difference between salvageable and career-ending. And somewhere across the back row, a younger SEAL trainee, barely past his pipeline evaluation, leaned toward the man next to him and whispered, "How did she do that?" The answer didn't come, because the silence had already swallowed it whole. The air in the debrief room was sterile and still, cool but not cold, quiet but not silent. The kind of room where truth gets extracted under fluorescent lights and the weight of official record. Captain Elena Thorne sat upright in a steel chair bolted to the floor. Her hands were folded in her lap, fingers interlaced, thumbs resting against each other. There were no handcuffs, no chain of custody, no armed escorts standing by the door. Just 3 officials seated across a metal table and 3 cameras recording every word, every breath, every micro-expression that crossed her face. 1 body cam, 2 mounted units, all angles covered. The naval legal officer sat to the left, stern-faced, mid-40s, glasses perched low on her nose like she'd been reading fine print for so long, her eyes had forgotten how to focus on anything else. Her nameplate read, Lieutenant Commander Walsh. The SEAL Command representative sat center. Arms crossed over his chest, rank stripes tight on his sleeves, jaw set in that particular way senior enlisted men hold their faces when they're deciding whether to defend one of their own or cut them loose. Master Chief Petty Officer Hendricks. 26 years in, he'd seen enough investigations to know the difference between a witch hunt and a legitimate inquiry. The Safety Oversight Director sat to the right, tapping the eraser end of a pencil against a yellow legal pad with quiet insistence. Civilian contractor. Former JAG. The kind of man who measured liability in decimal points and career trajectories in risk assessments. His badge read, Collins, no first name, no rank. Lena's expression was calm, not defiant, not apologetic, just clear. Lieutenant Commander Walsh spoke first, her voice flat and procedural. Captain Thorne, at what point did the training evolution deviate from approved protocol? Lena didn't hesitate. At the moment, Petty Officer Briggs applied full-force compression to my collarbone with his forearm, and Petty Officer Second Class Kessler locked my ankles in a competitive restraint hold. Master Chief Hendricks narrowed his eyes slightly. You're certain it was competitive force, not just aggressive demonstration contact? Elena's gaze didn't waver. There was no indicator of controlled speed or instructional technique. They broke simulation structure the moment contact began. Collins, the safety director, scribbled something on his pad. Walsh continued. Did you issue a verbal warning before counter-engaging? Yes. Exact words, please. Elena's voice didn't change pitch or volume. She recited it like she was reading from a manual, because in a way she was. The words had been drilled into her during Brennan Protocol certification. Memorized, practiced, activated only under specific threat conditions. I said, you are no longer inside demonstration protocol. Walsh paused, cross-checked the phrase against the tablet in front of her, scrolling through what looked like a preloaded training directive manual. Her finger stopped on a highlighted section. Confirmed code trigger phrase. That exact sentence had been logged in the Joint Forces Training Directive Manual under the Live Response Clause, a clause rarely invoked, even more rarely justified. Master Chief Hendricks pulled up a tablet of his own, swiping through time-synced footage from Camera 4. The muted playback showed it clearly. Briggs pressing down with full body weight, Kessler locking his grip with competition-level force. Elena's mouth forming the sentence, each syllable visible even without audio. Then the strikes, the breaks. Clean, clinical, no unnecessary escalation. Hendricks tapped the screen twice, freezing on the frame where Elena's hand was hooked under Briggs's elbow, his body already torquing sideways in the split second before the spiral fracture completed. Footage confirms, he said quietly. Collins looked up from his legal pad, pencil still. Was the level of force used proportional to the threat? Elena answered without blinking. I did not apply force. I redirected theirs. The three officials paused. That was the technical distinction, the legal firebreak. In Brennan Protocol, the practitioner doesn't generate the energy that causes injury. They redirect kinetic energy already being applied by the attacker. It's a principle borrowed from Aikido and refined through decades of military close-quarters combat research. The difference between assault and defense lives in that redirect. Walsh scrolled through another document on her tablet. Witness logs. Already they had 27 written testimonies from SEALs who'd been on the ground, all submitted within 2 hours of the incident, all consistent. She read aloud not to Elena, but to the record. Instructor issued warning. They ignored it. Her control was textbook, never escalated beyond necessary. She scrolled further. Not self-defense. It was surgical neutralization. Another entry. Briggs and Kessler broke the rules. She responded by the book. One testimony stood out from a veteran breacher with 15 years in naval special warfare. I've seen rookies panic and break people for less. She didn't panic. She calculated. They're lucky she held back. Lieutenant Commander Walsh closed the file, looked directly at Elena. Based on footage, testimony, and procedural guidelines, no violation of conduct, force, misuse, or insubordination will be filed. Elena gave a single nod. Her expression didn't change. Understood. Master Chief Hendricks exhaled heavily through his nose. It was the sound of a man who'd expected this to be complicated and was relieved it wasn't. This could have gone bad, he said. Elena's response was immediate. It didn't. There was no arrogance in her tone. Just fact. They dismissed her 5 minutes later. No escort needed, no reprimand issued. But the silence as she walked out, the way Master Chief Hendricks stood up a little straighter, as she passed the way Lieutenant Commander Walsh watched her go, was something that looked like respect, mixed with wariness that said everything. Behind her, the inquiry panel turned toward each other. Walsh spoke first. She's not a problem. Collins nodded, setting his pencil down for the first time since the session began. She's a standard. And for the first time that afternoon, even Master Chief Hendricks agreed. 8 hours after the Matt Petty Officer First Class Dalton Briggs lay in a hospital bed at Naval Medical Center, San Diego. The room smelled like antiseptic and the faint metallic tang of blood that even the best cleaning crews can't fully erase. His right arm was immobilized in a complex brace system that looked more like scaffolding than medical equipment. 3 surgical pins held his elbow together. His shoulder had been reconstructed with hardware that would set off metal detectors for the rest of his life. The morphine kept the worst of the pain at bay, but it also kept his thoughts sluggish, moving through his mind like vehicles through floodwater. Slow, heavy, unavoidable. He stared at the ceiling tiles. counting the small holes in the acoustic panels because it was better than thinking about how his career had just ended on a training mat in front of 300 witnesses. The door opened. Briggs turned his head, expecting a nurse with another round of vitals checks and uncomfortable questions about pain levels. Instead, his father walked in. Retired Colonel Raymond Briggs was 69 years old. He wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, but he still moved like a man who'd spent 40 years in uniform. Shoulders back, spine straight, eyes that had seen Grenada in '83 and Panama in '89, and a dozen other operations that didn't have names, only dates and grid coordinates burned into classified after-action reports. He pulled a chair close to the bed, sat down without asking permission. His face was unreadable. "Tell me what happened," he said. His voice was quiet but carried the kind of weight that made lying impossible. "Truth." Briggs closed his eyes, opened them. The morphine made it easier to be honest because it stripped away the defenses he would have normally built between himself and shame. "We violated protocol, Dad." His father didn't respond, just waited. "We thought—" Briggs's voice caught. He swallowed. Tried again. "I thought I could prove she wasn't qualified, that she was just there for optics, for the diversity checklist. I thought if we pushed hard enough, she'd fold, or freeze, or call for help." He looked down at his immobilized arm. "But she warned us. She told us we were outside protocol, and we didn't listen." Colonel Briggs was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than his son expected. "In 1983, I was stationed at Fort Bragg, training officer for a Ranger battalion. We had a new combat medic instructor, woman named Sarah Brennan, 23 years old, maybe 130 pounds. Some of the men gave her hell, questioned her credentials, made jokes." He leaned forward slightly. "One day a Ranger captain decided to test her during a demonstration. Same kind of scenario you just went through. Underwater extraction, simulated entanglement. He pinned her hard, thought he was making a point about physical standards. Briggs already knew where this was going. His chest felt tight. She folded him in front of 40 Rangers, broke his collarbone, pulling him through a gap he didn't think he'd fit through. He screamed, thought she was trying to kill him. But she saved his life in that exact scenario 3 months later during a training accident off the coast. Broke him to save him." Colonel Briggs reached out and placed one hand on his son's good shoulder. "Some lessons cost bones to learn, son. The question isn't whether you got hurt. The question is, did you learn?" Dalton Briggs felt something hot behind his eyes. He nodded. Yeah, I learned." His father squeezed once, then let go. "Good, then this wasn't a waste." In another room 2 floors down, Petty Officer Second Class Cade Kessler sat on the edge of his hospital bed, staring at the complex wrap that covered his right forearm from wrist to elbow. The surgery had taken 3 hours. Compartment syndrome release. Nerve damage assessment still ongoing. The surgeon had been professional but blunt. Full recovery uncertain. Might regain 80% function. Might be 60. Might be career-ending. His older brother sat in the chair by the window. Civilian, lawyer. Expensive suit even on a weekend. He'd driven down from Los Angeles the moment he got the call. "We can sue," his brother said, "not for the first time. This is assault. You've got witnesses. You've got footage. You've got a medical record that speaks for itself." Kessler didn't respond immediately. He flexed his fingers, slowly testing the limits of what his hand could still do. 3 fingers responded normally. His ring finger lagged. His pinky barely moved. "And say what?" Kessler finally replied. His voice was flat, tired. "That I violated training protocol during a sanctioned demonstration, that I was warned I was outside acceptable parameters and continued anyway, that I got exactly the response I was told would happen if I didn't stop." His brother leaned forward. "You don't have to frame it that way. That's the only way to frame it, because that's what happened. Your career, my career is over anyway." Kessler looked down at his wrapped arm. The anger he'd felt in the immediate aftermath, the white-hot rage at being beaten by someone he'd underestimated, had cooled into something else, something closer to recognition. "She warned us," he said quietly. "She told us exactly what would happen." And we laughed. His brother sat back frustrated. "So you're just going to accept this?" Kessler was silent for a long time. Then he nodded once. Yeah, I am. The official reports were never posted publicly. No base-wide memo, no all-hands meeting, no email trail circulating through command. But word spread fast. Within 48 hours, the internal action logs were updated with two entries that every SEAL at Trident Complex would read before the week was out. Entry 1, Petty Officer First Class Dalton Briggs. Medical separation from active duty. Diagnosis compound shoulder dislocation. Torn ulnar collateral ligament. Complete elbow ligament. Rupture requiring surgical reconstruction. Official cause injury sustained during unauthorized application of combat force during controlled training exercise. Entry 2, Petty Officer Second Class Cade Kessler, removed indefinitely from Poseidon Team operational track. Misconduct logged under violation of instructional boundary during designated demonstration event. Performance profile flagged unfit for training environments involving force moderation protocols. Both men were removed from the Trident rotation before the end of the week. No farewell formation, no handshakes in the chow line. Just gone. The command didn't need to explain. Everyone who'd watched the mat that day already knew. They weren't taken out for losing. They were taken out for breaking rules they thought didn't apply to them. And the one who stopped them was still there, still arriving at the training compound at 0530, still running silent diagnostic checks on medical equipment before the first class of the day. Still saying little, doing more, moving through the facility like someone who didn't need to prove anything because the proof had already happened on record in real time under the witness of 301 men who would never forget it. On the fourth day following the incident, Commander Daniel Garrett posted an update to the rotation roster. He did it quietly without announcement during the morning hours when most SEALs were either in physical training or still sleeping off night operations. The update appeared in the digital duty log under the column for lead instructor constraint survival protocols. Previous entry, TBD pending review. New entry, Thorn E, promoted to lead effective immediately. There was no ceremony, no speech, no formal notification beyond the roster change itself, just a name. But across the base, men noticed. In the chow hall, a group of younger SEALs stared at the duty board displayed on the mounted screen. One of them, barely 24, fresh from his first deployment, read the entry twice to make sure he wasn't misreading it. She got the lead position. His teammate, a few years older, nodded slowly. After what she did, yeah, she earned it. No one laughed. No one questioned it. No one made a joke about diversity hires or political correctness or lowered standards. The mockery had stopped. The smirks had disappeared. And the newest recruits who joined training rotations in the days and weeks that followed watched Elena Thorne closely. Listened when she spoke. Took notes when she demonstrated techniques. And not one of them, not a single man ever stepped onto that mat with her and made a joke about ois or strength again. Because the myth had been rewritten, not with noise, not with speeches or policy changes or sensitivity training, with breaks. It was late. The kind of late where the compound lights dimmed automatically to conserve power, and only the gravel crunch of boots marked who was still working. The sun had been gone for hours. Most of the base had cleared out. Evening chow was over. Barracks lights were starting to flicker on in the distance. Captain Elena Thorne stood alone near the edge of the secondary training pit, reorganizing trauma kits from that afternoon's final drill. No noise, no hurry, just steady hands moving through a checklist that existed only in her head. The medic she'd run the course with had already clocked out. The equipment cage was locked. The mat area was empty. She worked in silence the way she always had. Then she heard footsteps. Not hurried, not heavy, measured, deliberate. The kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who'd walked through enough hostile territory to know the difference between approaching and stalking. Elena didn't turn around, just kept sorting until the boots stopped 3 paces behind her. You don't fold someone like that unless they ask for it. She looked up. Commander Daniel Garrett stood with his hands clasped behind his back. Parade rest the way senior officers stand when they're not giving orders, but want you to know they're still in command. He was 71 years old, 19 deployments across 4 decades. Half his body was scar tissue from shrapnel and salt. He didn't speak often, not unless he had something no one else could say. His expression wasn't hard, wasn't soft either. It just was. Elena met his eyes. They didn't give me a choice, sir. Garrett nodded once. slow, deliberate. That's what I mean. A pause. The wind off the ocean carried the sound of waves hitting the rocks below the compound. Distant, rhythmic. You didn't fold them out of anger, Garrett continued. You folded them because they pinned you like amateurs. That's the difference. He didn't wait for a reply, didn't offer a handshake, didn't ask for thanks or acknowledgement. He just turned and walked away, boots crunching on gravel, figure disappearing into the shadows between buildings. But that single moment, those 14 words, they hit harder than 100 salutes. Later that night, back inside the main facility, Elena passed the updated duty roster again. It was mounted near the gear lockers, laminated against the humidity that ate through paper in coastal bases. She didn't slow down, didn't smile, didn't stop to read her own name printed in the lead instructor column. But as she walked past 3 junior SEALs waiting to check their locker assignments, stepped aside. No one said a word. They didn't have to, because respect like this doesn't arrive with applause. It doesn't come with ceremonies or speeches or official commendations. It arrives in silence, in the way men clear space when they once crowded dead, in the way no one forgets the sound of 2 breaks happening in 4 seconds, in the way a roster update needs no explanation because everyone already understands what it means. The next morning, Elena walked into the primary training facility at 05:45, 15 minutes earlier than required. The same routine she'd followed for years. Check equipment, review lesson plans, prep medical supplies, ensure everything was ready before the first student arrived. But when she opened the door to the main instruction room, she stopped. Lieutenant Garrett Hollis stood near the front row of chairs. 24 years old, fresh-faced, the kind of young SEAL who still believed the Navy was exactly what the recruiters promised it would be. He wasn't alone. 12 other SEALs sat in the chairs, waiting, gear already staged, notebooks open, pens ready, voluntary attendance. No requirement, no order, no mandatory training log entry forcing them to be there. They'd come because they wanted to learn. Hollis straightened when Elena entered, not to attention exactly, but close, respectful. Captain Thorne, he said, we'd like to learn, properly, this time. Elena looked across the group, recognized a few faces from the ring, younger operators, men who'd been watching when Briggs and Kessler went down, men who'd probably had questions, doubts, concerns about what they'd seen. Now they wanted answers. Elena set her gear bag down near the front of the room, pulled out her training harness, her simulated constraint equipment, her medical kit. She didn't give a speech, didn't ask why they were there or what changed their minds. She just nodded once. Let's begin. And for the next 90 minutes, she taught them what Briggs and Kessler learned the hard way. That size doesn't matter when physics is on your side. That strength means nothing when leverage is against you. That the most dangerous person in a room isn't the biggest or the loudest. It's the one who knows exactly how much force is needed and exactly how much to hold back. By the end of the session, every man in that room understood something they hadn't understood before. Captain Elena Thorne wasn't an instructor because of policy. She was an instructor because she was the best person for the job. And the mat had proved it in a language every warrior understands. Pain, control, survival. The kind of lesson you only need to learn once. The air in the debrief room was sterile and still, cool but not cold, quiet but not silent. The kind of institutional space designed to strip away emotion and leave only facts on the table between interrogator and subject. Captain Elena Thorne sat upright in a steel chair bolted to the floor, hands folded in her lap, expression calm. There was no chain of custody, no cuffs, no tension in her shoulders, just clarity. Across the table, 3 officials. A naval legal officer, stern-faced glasses, perched low on her nose, fingers steepled like she was calculating the angles of prosecution before the questions even started. A SEAL Command representative, arms crossed, rank stripes tight on his sleeves, jaw set in the expression of a man who'd already decided guilt or innocence and was now just waiting for confirmation. A safety oversight director tapping the eraser of his pencil against a yellow notepad with quiet insistence, the rhythm almost hypnotic in the otherwise silent room. The inquiry wasn't hostile. It was necessary. 3 cameras recorded the session, 1 body cam worn by the legal officer. Two mounted in opposite corners of the room, lenses wide enough to capture every micro-expression, every shift in posture, every word that would later be transcribed and analyzed by people who'd never set foot on a training mat, but would decide careers based on paragraph structure and procedural compliance. The legal officer spoke first. Her voice was flat, professional, the kind of tone that telegraphed years of depositions and courts-martial and men who thought charm would save them from consequences. Captain Thorne, at what point did the training evolution deviate from approved protocol? Elena didn't hesitate. Her answer came clean and immediate, no preamble, no hedging. At the moment, Petty Officer Briggs applied full-force compression to my collarbone with his horn, and Petty Officer First Class Kessler locked my ankles in a competitive restraint hold. The command representative narrowed his eyes, leaned forward slightly. "You're certain it was competitive? There was no indicator of controlled speed or technique demonstration?" They broke simulation structure the moment contact began. The safety director scribbled something. The legal officer tapped her tablet twice, pulling up a reference document that had been preloaded into the system hours before this meeting even started. "Did you issue a verbal warning before counter-engaging?" "Yes, exact words. You are no longer inside demonstration protocol." The legal officer paused, cross-referenced the phrase with the manual on her screen. Her expression didn't change, but her pencil stopped moving. That was confirmation enough. The phrase had been logged in the Joint Forces Training Directive Manual under the Live Response Clause, a clause rarely invoked and even more rarely justified. It was the verbal equivalent of pulling a ripcord. Once spoken, it shifted the engagement from educational to survival. From demonstration, documentation. The SEAL command rep scrolled through the time-synced feed from camera 4. The footage was muted, but the imagery was clear. Briggs pressing down with full body weight, Kessler locking grip with competition-level intensity, Elena's mouth forming the sentence, her voice carrying across the mat, even though the audio was off. Then the strikes, the breaks, clean, clinical, no unnecessary escalation, no wasted motion. He tapped the screen twice and looked up. The footage confirms. The safety director finally looked up from his notes. Was the level of force used proportional to the threat? Elena's answer was flat. Matter of fact, no emotion, no justification, just mechanical recitation of what had occurred. "I did not apply force, I redirected theirs." The room paused. The legal officer scrolled to the witness logs. Already 27 written testimonies had been submitted from SEALs who'd been on the ground, all consistent in their accounts. Not identical, which would have suggested coordination, but consistent, which suggested accuracy. Instructor issued warning. They ignored it. Her control was textbook. Never escalated beyond necessary. One entry stood out, submitted by a veteran breacher who'd been standing in the second row close enough to hear the sound of ligaments separating. "I've seen rookies panic and break people for less. She didn't panic, she calculated. They're lucky she held back." The legal officer closed the file. "Based on footage, testimony, and procedural guidelines, no violation of conduct, force misuse, or insubordination will be filed." Elena gave a single nod. "Understood." The SEAL command representative exhaled heavily through his nose. It wasn't relief, it wasn't approval. It was the sound of a man realizing the situation could have been catastrophic and somehow wasn't. "This could have gone bad." "It didn't," Elena replied. There was no arrogance in her tone, just fact. They dismissed her 5 minutes later. No escort needed, no reprimand issued. But the silence as she walked out, the way the SEAL rep stood up straight as she passed, said everything that needed saying. Behind her, the inquiry panel turned toward each other. The legal officer spoke first. "She's not a problem." The safety director nodded. "She's a standard." And for the first time that afternoon, even the SEAL command representative agreed. The official reports were never posted publicly. No base-wide memo, no all-hands meeting, no email trail circulating through command channels that would eventually leak to forums and blogs where retired operators dissected every decision the Navy made. But word spread fast. Within 48 hours, the internal action logs were updated. Quiet entries made in personnel files that most people would never see, but everyone who mattered would know about. 1. Petty Officer First Class Dalton Briggs. Medically separated from active duty, pending recovery evaluation. Diagnosis: compound shoulder dislocation, torn ulnar collateral ligament, complete. Elbow ligament rupture, requiring surgical reconstruction with permanent hardware installation. Official cause: injury, sustained during unauthorized application of combat force during controlled training exercise. 2. Petty Officer Second Class Cade Kessler. Removed indefinitely from Poseidon operational track. Misconduct logged under violation of instructional boundary during designated demonstration event. Performance profile flagged unfit for training environments involving force moderation or instructional scenarios requiring judgment under pressure. Both men were removed from the Trident schedule before the end of the week. No farewell formation, no handshakes in the chow line, no jokes about getting back on the horse. Just gone. The command didn't need to explain. Everyone who had watched the mat that day already knew. They weren't taken out for losing. They were taken out for breaking rules they thought didn't apply to them because they were bigger, stronger, more experienced. And the one who stopped them was still there, still arriving early to the training compound at 05:30, still running silent diagnostic checks on gear before drills started, still saying little, doing more, moving, like someone who didn't need to prove anything because the proof had already happened on record in real time, under pressure, with 301 witnesses. On the fourth day following the incident, Commander Daniel Garrett posted an update to the rotation roster. Quietly, without announcement. Just a name moved from one column to another in the digital spreadsheet that governed who taught what and when. Right beneath the column for lead instructor constraint survival protocols. Thorn E, promoted to lead. Effective immediately. There was no ceremony, no speech, no gathering of personnel to applaud the decision or debate its merits. Just a name. But across the base, men noticed. No one laughed. No one questioned it. No one said a word when her name moved to the top of the instructor roster, replacing a slot that had been held by a Master Chief with 23 years of service, who'd quietly requested transfer to another facility the day after the mat incident. Instead, they adjusted. The mockery stopped. The smirks disappeared. And the newer recruits who joined drills in the weeks that followed watched her closely. They listened when she spoke. And not one of them, not a single operator, fresh off the pipeline, or rotating in from another command, ever stepped onto that mat with her and joked about strength again. Because the myth had already been rewritten. Not with noise, but with breaks. 8 hours after the incident, Dalton Briggs lay in a hospital bed at Naval Medical Center, San Diego. The morphine had dulled the worst of the pain, but his mind was clearing enough now to replay the sequence. Over and over. Frame by frame. Like watching footage from a helmet cam after a mission gone wrong, trying to identify the exact moment where everything fell apart. The IV drip clicked softly. The monitors beeped in steady rhythm. His right arm was immobilized in a complex brace that looked like it belonged on a combat exoskeleton, titanium rods, and compression sleeves holding bones and ligaments in alignment while his body tried to remember how joints were supposed to work. The door opened without a knock. Colonel Raymond Briggs entered, 69 years old, retired, but you'd never know it from the way he carried himself. Shoulders back, spine straight, the kind of posture that doesn't soften with age because it was built from years of discipline that became identity. He wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a flannel shirt, but the way he moved through the room still felt like inspection. He'd served in Grenada in 1980, Panama in 1989, been part of operations that didn't have names in the public record, only dates and grid coordinates buried in files stamped with classifications that wouldn't expire for another 30 years. He'd taught his son everything he knew about being a warrior, about strength, about dominance, about the hierarchy of combat and where women fit into that structure. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down without asking permission. His eyes scanned the medical equipment, the brace, the way his son's face was still tight with pain, even through the drugs. "Tell me what happened," he said. His voice wasn't angry, it was flat, the tone of a man who wanted facts, not excuses. Truth. Dalton swallowed. His throat was dry from the anesthesia. When he spoke, his voice came out rougher than he intended. "We violated protocol, Dad. I thought I could prove she wasn't qualified. that she was just another diversity checkbox, and if we pushed hard enough, she'd break down and everyone would see it. He paused, winced, not from physical pain, from the memory. But she warned us. She told us flat out that we were outside protocol, that if we escalated, she would too. And we didn't listen. We thought, hell, I don't know what we thought. That size mattered more than technique, that two of us could handle one of her. His father's expression didn't change. He just listened. Dalton continued, words coming faster now, like a confession he'd been holding since the moment his elbow bent the wrong way. She folded me in 2 seconds, Dad. 2 seconds. I didn't even see the move. One moment I'm pinning her, the next I'm on the mat and my arms screaming and I can't breathe, and all I can think is that she warned me. She gave me a chance to stop and I didn't take it. Colonel Briggs leaned back slightly. His hands rested on his knees. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of experience that couldn't be taught, only earned. Son, I was at Fort Bragg in 1983 when Captain Sarah Brennan first demonstrated those techniques to a room full of Special Forces operators. Saw her fold a captain who thought exactly the same thing you did. Thought his size and his Ranger tab meant he couldn't be beaten by someone half his weight. He paused, let that sink in. She broke his collarbone and dislocated his shoulder in front of 40 men who'd all believed the same thing. Some lessons cost bones to learn. The question isn't whether you learned it. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Dalton stared at the ceiling, blinked once, twice. Then something broke in his expression, not physically, emotionally, the kind of crack that happens when ego finally gives way to reality. I learned it, he whispered. I learned that I don't know a goddamn thing about what makes someone qualified, and I'm sorry it took breaking my arm to figure that out. His father nodded once, stood, placed one hand on his son's shoulder, careful to avoid the brace. Good, now heal. And when you're done healing, you make sure every other man who thinks like you used to gets taught the same lesson. Without breaking bones, if you can help it. He walked out without another word. Dalton Briggs lay in that bed for another 6 hours before the next dose of pain medication knocked him unconscious. But he spent every minute of those 6 hours thinking about the sound his elbow made when it gave way, and the look in Captain Elena Thorne's eyes when she'd stabilize his arm afterward. Not triumph, just control. In the hospital room 3 doors down, Cade Kessler had a different visitor. His older brother Marcus, 34 years old, civilian. Corporate lawyer in Los Angeles who'd spent the last decade in courtrooms arguing liability cases and personal injury claims. He wore an expensive suit even though visiting hours were almost over. Carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most SEALs made in a month. He set the briefcase on the table beside the bed and opened it without preamble. We can sue, Marcus said. No greeting. No, how are you feeling? Just straight to strategy. This is assault. You've got witnesses, footage, medical documentation of permanent nerve damage. We could argue that the Navy failed to maintain a safe training environment and that the instructor used excessive force. Cade stared at his wrapped forearm. The compartment syndrome surgery had left a drainage tube still attached to his arm, clear fluid trickling into a collection bag hanging from the side of the bed. The doctors had said he might regain 80% function if he was lucky. If he worked at physical therapy like it was a full-time job. If the nerve damage wasn't as bad as the initial scans suggested. And say what, Cade finally spoke. His voice was hollow. That I violated training protocol that was clearly briefed. That I ignored a verbal warning issued in front of 300 witnesses. That I applied competitive force during a controlled demonstration and got exactly the response I was told would happen if I escalated. Marcus frowned. You're a victim here, Cade. She injured you. No, Cade shook his head. The motion was small, tired. I injured myself. She just responded to what I started. Your career is over anyway, Marcus pressed. The nerve damage alone? I know, Cade interrupted. I know my career is over, and I have to live with that, but I'm not going to spend the rest of my life blaming someone else for a choice I made. Marcus closed the briefcase slowly, studied his younger brother for a long moment. Then he stood, adjusted his tie, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he paused. You're better than I thought you were. It wasn't a compliment, but it wasn't an insult either. Cade didn't respond, just stared at his arm and wondered if he'd ever be able to grip a rifle again. The formal investigation took 2 days. Day 1 was procedural, evidence review. camera footage from 4 angles including Kessler's body cam, which showed everything in brutal clarity. The approach, the violation, the warning, the escalation, the brakes. The audio was particularly damning. You could hear Elena's voice calm and clear, cutting through the ambient noise of 300 breathing men. You are no longer inside demonstration protocol. And then you could hear Briggs' response, dismissive, arrogant, delivered like he was doing her a favor by participating. "Show us something real, Sergeant." Followed by Kessler tightening his grip with enough force that you could hear the fabric of his gloves creaking. The medical reports were equally clear. Briggs's injuries were consistent with a spiral lock technique executed with precise control. The fracture pattern that showed rotational force applied at the joint, not impact trauma. The kind of injury you get from controlled manipulation, not wild aggression. Kessler's forearm damage matched a heel hook reversal pressure applied to the exact anatomical weak point where the radial nerve passes over bone. Again, surgical precision, not excessive force. Historical precedent was pulled from the database. 47 documented uses of Brennan protocol in training environments across 4 decades. 12 had resulted in injuries. All 12 had occurred when students violated protocol and refused to comply with instructor warnings. 0 injuries had occurred during compliant demonstrations. Day 2 was testimony. Senior Chief Marcus Calloway was called first. 48 years old, scarred face, quiet demeanor. The kind of operator who'd earned respect through actions, not words, and hadn't felt the need to speak more than necessary in 2 decades of service. He sat in the same steel chair Elena had occupied the day before. Same cameras recording, same panel asking questions. "Senior Chief Calloway, can you describe your relationship to Captain Thorne?" "She saved my life." The room paused. "Can you elaborate?" Calloway's expression didn't change. His voice remained flat, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper. Gratitude mixed with the kind of debt that can't be repaid. Philippine Sea 2019, USS Connecticut. Pressure hull failure during deep dive training. I was trapped at 380 feet with a collapsed lung and 60 seconds of air left in my tank. Captain Thorne, then a lieutenant, found me in 0 visibility conditions. Performed a needle decompression on my lung using a dive knife in a CO2 cartridge while water was rising around us. He paused, took a breath. Then she dislocated my shoulder to pull me through a bulkhead gap that was 14 inches wide. I screamed into my regulator, thought she was killing me, but she was saving me. Because that's what the Brennan Protocol does. It causes pain to prevent death. He looked directly at the panel. Briggs and Kessler aren't dead. They're injured, which means she held back. And if you think what happened on that mat was excessive, you've never been trapped underwater with someone who knows exactly how much force to use and when to use it. The legal officer made a note. The command rep nodded slowly. Lieutenant Garrett Hollis was called next. 24 years old, fresh face, less than a year out of buds. He'd been standing in the front row when it happened close enough to see every detail. "Lieutenant Hollis, what was your impression of the incident?" Hollis didn't hesitate. "I've been through SEER, Bud's advanced combat training. I've seen men fight in ways most people can't imagine. What I saw on that mat wasn't assault. It was the most controlled violence I've ever witnessed." He leaned forward slightly. "She could have killed them. Collapsed Briggs's throat instead of locking his elbow. Shattered Kessler's wrist instead of controlling the forearm. But she didn't. She calibrated to injure just enough to stop the threat. That's not excessive force. That's extraordinary control." 27 written testimonies were submitted. Statements from SEALs across the experience spectrum. The pattern was clear. Older operators understood immediately what had happened. Younger ones were divided, some defensive, some in awe, but all consistent on the facts. Elena followed protocol. Briggs and Kessler violated it. On the afternoon of day 2, Commander Daniel Garrett himself testified. He sat in the chair with the kind of calm that comes from knowing you've already made the decision that matters, and now you're just explaining it to people who need to hear it said out loud. "Commander Garrett, why did you select Petty Officers Briggs and Kessler as volunteers for this demonstration?" Garrett didn't blink. "Because they had documented patterns of protocol violations and needed to learn a lesson under conditions where failure had consequences." The room went very quiet. The legal officer adjusted her glasses. You anticipated they would violate protocol. Yes. And you didn't intervene. No. Why not? Garrett leaned back slightly. His voice remained level, but there was steel underneath. Because the demonstration's purpose wasn't to show controlled cooperation. It was to validate the Brennan Protocol under genuine hostile pressure. Captain Thorne needed to prove that her techniques work not just when students are compliant, but when they're actively hostile. Admiral Victoria Strand, who'd been silent until now, spoke for the first time. Her voice carried the authority of 3 stars and 30 years navigating Pentagon politics. You used your men as test subjects, Commander. I used 2 officers who needed accountability as educational tools, Garrett replied. They're alive. They'll recover. Their injuries will heal. And 301 SEALs learned what happens when you mistake size for capability and arrogance for strength. He paused. Let that hang in the air. I'm retiring in 6 months, Admiral. Before I leave, I want the Brennan Protocol, now the Thorne Protocol, adopted Navy-wide as mandatory training for all Special Operations Forces. I needed undeniable proof that it works under real-world hostile conditions. Captain Thorne gave me that proof. And Briggs and Kessler gave 301 witnesses a lesson they'll never forget. The room was silent for 10 seconds. Then Admiral Strand closed her folder. This inquiry is concluded. No charges will be filed. Captain Thorne's actions are deemed appropriate and proportional. Petty Officers Briggs and Kessler will face administrative review for protocol violations. This session is adjourned. But the firestorm was just beginning. Kessler's body cam footage had leaked within hours of the incident. Not the full version, a 30-second clip. Edited, no audio of Elena's warning, no context of the protocol violation. Just the visual of a woman folding 2 large men with techniques that look brutal out of context. The title on the military forum where it first appeared, Female Instructor Assaults 2 SEALs During Training Demonstration. Within 24 hours, it had spread to social media, then news outlets. Conservative blogs ran headlines about diversity quotas leading to dangerous instructors. Progressive outlets countered with stories about female empowerment and self-defense. Cable news brought on former military personnel to debate whether women should be in combat training roles at all. Nobody had the full context. Nobody wanted it. The story was too good without facts getting in the way. Elena sat in her temporary quarters and watched her phone light up with notifications. Messages from former colleagues, interview requests from journalists, angry emails from strangers who'd watched 15 seconds of footage and decided they knew everything about who she was and what she'd done. She turned the phone off, sat in silence, stared at her hands. The same hands that had saved 2 men in the Philippine Sea. The same hands that had broken 2 men on a training mat. The same hands that could perform a needle decompression at 380 feet or fold a joint with surgical precision. For the first time since the incident, doubt crept in. Not about the technique, not about the legality, but about the cost. She'd done everything right, followed every protocol, issued the warning, used proportional force, held back when she could have done permanent damage. And now her face was on the internet attached to words like assault and excessive and dangerous. At 2100 hours, there was a knock on her door. She opened it to find Admiral Victoria Strand standing in the hallway. No aide, no security, just a 3-star admiral in working uniform who'd apparently decided this conversation needed to happen off the record. Elena stepped aside. Strand entered, sat in the single chair near the window. The inquiry cleared you, Strand said without preamble. Legally, you did nothing wrong. Morally, you were justified. Procedurally, you were exemplary. Oh, she paused. Politically, you're toxic. Elena remained standing, waiting. I can make this disappear, Strand continued. Transfer you to an administrative role. Good assignment. Shore duty. No more training rotations. No more combat zones. The incident gets sealed. Your record stays clean. You serve out the rest of your career in relative comfort and retire with full honors. Another pause. Or you stay. You fight to remain as lead instructor. You become the face of this debate, whether you want to be or not. You deal with the media, the scrutiny, the men who'll test you every single day to see if you'll break. And you live with knowing that every decision you make will be analyzed by people who've never done what you do. Strand stood. You have 24 hours to decide. She walked to the door, stopped, turned back. For what it's worth, I hope you stay. Because if you leave, it proves to every woman coming after you that excellence isn't enough. That you can do everything right and still lose. Then she was gone. Elena stood alone in the room. The silence was heavier now. Different. She thought about walking away, about taking the administrative role and teaching from behind a desk where technique didn't require breaking bones to prove points. But she also thought about the young female SEAL candidates in the pipeline, the ones who'd hear about this incident and wonder if competence would ever be enough, the ones who'd face the same skepticism, the same tests, the same men who thought size mattered more than skill. At 22:30 hours, she made a phone call. The line rang 3 times before it was answered. Thorne, I was wondering when you'd call. Captain Sarah Brennan retired, 63 years old, the woman who'd pioneered the protocol that now carried both their names. The woman who'd broken Commander Daniel Garrett's collarbone in 1982 to save his life and been buried in administrative roles for 15 years because of it. I need advice, Elena said quietly. You need permission, Sarah corrected. You already know what you're going to do. You just want someone to tell you it's okay. Elena was silent. Sarah's voice softened slightly. In 1982, I folded a man in front of his entire platoon, saved his life by breaking him. The Navy tried to bury me for it. Took me 15 years to get back to operational training. 15 years of desk work and resentment in watching men I'd trained get promoted while I stayed frozen. She paused. But you know what, that man, I broke Daniel Garrett. He never forgot. And now he's the one who called you in to do what I did 42 years ago. That's legacy, Elena. That's what happens when you refuse to walk away. I'll lose, Elena said. Even if I stay, even if I keep teaching, I'll always be the woman who broke 2 SEALs. That's all anyone will remember. No, Sarah replied firmly. You'll be the woman who taught 301 SEALs that protocol matters, that warnings matter, that control matters more than signing, and every man who watched you work will remember that for the rest of their careers. Another pause. The question isn't whether you can handle the fight, Elena. The question is whether you want to keep breaking people to save them, or if you'd rather walk away and let someone else teach the lessons you've already paid for in bone and blood. Elena closed her eyes, took a breath. I'm staying. Good, Sarah said. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be harder than today, and the day after that will be harder still. But you're a thorn. You don't break. You fold others. The line went dead. Elena stood in the darkness of her quarters for another hour. Then she lay down fully clothed on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling until 4:30, when her alarm went off and it was time to start another day of being exactly who she'd always been, competent, or controlled, and unwilling to apologize for either. The next morning, before Admiral Strand's 24-hour deadline expired, Petty Officer First Class Dalton Briggs released a public statement from his hospital bed. It was brief, handwritten on Naval Medical Center letterhead, photographed and distributed through official channels before the media could spin it into something it wasn't. I violated training protocol during a demonstration led by Captain Elena Thorne. I was clearly briefed on acceptable parameters. I chose to exceed those parameters. Captain Thorne responded appropriately per her training and certification. I have no complaints, no charges to file, and no ill will toward the instructor. I learned a lesson I should have learned before I put on this uniform. Respect isn't given based on size or strength. It's earned through competence, discipline, and the ability to follow orders. Captain Thorne is competent. I was not. I take full responsibility for my injuries and the consequences of my actions. It was signed, dated, witnessed by his father, Colonel Raymond Briggs, USA, retired. The statement went viral faster than the original footage. Within hours, the narrative shifted. Conservative outlets that had been calling for Elena's dismissal suddenly went quiet. Progressive outlets praised Briggs for accountability, but stopped making the story about gender. Military forums exploded with debate, but the tone changed. Instead of arguing about whether women belonged in combat training, operators started discussing protocol violations and the importance of following instructor guidance regardless of who was delivering it. 3 days later, Admiral Strand held a brief press conference. She read a prepared statement confirming that Captain Thorne had been cleared of all wrongdoing, that Petty Officers Briggs and Kessler would face administrative consequences for protocol violations, and that the Brennan-Thorne Protocol was under review for expanded implementation across Special Operations Forces. Then she took questions. Admiral, do you believe this incident proves women aren't suited for combat training roles? Strand's expression didn't change. This incident proves that protocol exists for a reason. When operators violate protocol, consequences follow. Gender is irrelevant. Competence is not. What message does this send to female service members? The same message it sends to male service members. Follow orders, respect your instructors, and understand that rank, experience, and certification matter more than physical size. Will Captain Thorne continue teaching? Captain Thorne has been promoted to lead instructor for constraint survival protocols, effective immediately. That should answer your question. The press conference ended. Elena never attended. She was already back at Trident, preparing for her first class as lead instructor, scheduled for 0600 the following morning. When she arrived at the training facility at 0530, she expected to find it empty. Instead, she found 12 SEALs waiting, seated in the bleachers, quiet, respectful. Lieutenant Garrett Hollis stood when she entered. Captain, we'd like to learn, properly, this time. Elena set her gear bag down, looked at the 12 faces watching her. Some she recognized from the mat incident. Others were new. All of them had made a choice to be there. She nodded once. Fall in. We start with pressure points and joint mechanics. You're going to learn why size doesn't matter and technique does. And you're going to learn it without anyone getting hurt. She paused. Unless you violate protocol, then all bets are off. It wasn't a joke. No one laughed. They just nodded and took their positions on the mat. The session lasted 90 minutes. By the end, every man in that room understood something fundamental, something that most warriors spend entire careers never learning. Size doesn't win fights. Technique does. Strength doesn't save lives. Control does. And competence isn't something you're given based on gender or rank or how much you can bench press. It's something you prove every single day, on every single mat, in every single moment when someone doubts you and you have to decide whether to break them or teach them. Captain Elena Thorne had made her choice. She would teach, and if breaking was required to make the lesson stick, then bones would break. But only when protocol was violated, only when warnings were ignored, only when there was no other choice. As the 12 SEALs filed out of the training facility, Lieutenant Hollis lingered near the door. Captain, he said quietly, thank you. Elena didn't ask what he was thanking her for. She already knew. Not for the techniques, for refusing to walk away, for proving that competence doesn't apologize, for showing every person who would come after you that excellence when backed by protocol and controlled with precision is enough. She nodded once. Hollis left. Elena stood alone in the empty training facility morning light, just beginning to filter through the high windows, and allowed herself one moment of satisfaction. Not because she'd won, but because she'd stayed. And staying, she was learning, was sometimes the hardest fight of all.